Hi everybody, Professor Gassimi here. We've now arrived at the tutorial component of the lecture, and as I mentioned in the introduction this week, the tutorials from here on out are going to be a lot more lightweight. The reason for that is because at this stage you really know everything you need to know to perform NLP. Once you intuitively understand different tokenization strategies, you understand how to build neural networks, you know how to do assessment of models, splitting them into training and testing sets, and when to look at the validation and when to look at the test. Once all those things are sort of clear to you, you have the whole NLP processing pipeline down in your head. And so there's not too much more that I think I can give you that doesn't already exist from going over extensive tutorials any longer. Instead, from here on out, and particularly in the next set of tutorials that I give you, I'll probably be referring you to some external resources that are useful. And then I will give you a homework problem where you will have more degrees of freedom for how you'd like to go about solving it, just using the tools that you've learned up until the present. Okay, so let's get started. The goal of this particular tutorial is to cover three things. The first is data-driven tokenization. This sort of builds on the byte pair encoding things that we discussed in the early lectures. We're going to talk about sequence-to-sequence models with attention. And then finally, we're going to end the tutorial with a discussion about transformers. Okay? As usual, remember that you need to pull the latest version of this repository. You need to move things into the correct folders and so on and so forth when you're doing the assignment. Okay, you have worked with quite a lot of text data at this stage in the course. We worked with books from philosophers. We've worked with a couple of different data sets that were provided by the Hugging Face library, and you've also looked at some text data in the course of or in the pursuit of your projects. If you decide that you want to really get big with data sets in the NLP community, you're almost inevitably going to have to touch the information from the World Wide Web. And if you wanted to collect all the information on the World Wide Web to, for instance, build very strong models like many of the contemporary transformer models used, you would need a way of obviously crawling the web. Now, instead of you building a crawler yourself, if you decide to go down this path, I thought it'd be useful to sort of point you to some resources that exist that could be useful. So there is this particular resource, Common Crawl, which maintains an open repository of web crawl data that can be accessed and analyzed by anyone. So this is sort of like Google has a crawler or Microsoft Bing has a crawler. Well, this is an open crawler that you could use to get information on the World Wide Web with billions of pages, trillions of links, petabytes of data. So if you really have big ambitions in NLP for your PhD, for instance, this might be a good place for you to take a look. Okay, I should note that the format of the data on Common Crawl is in WARC format, which is a little bit tricky to kind of work with if you've never done it. And so if you'd prefer to work with something a little simpler, there's actually a corpus of the internet's data called OSCAR, or Open Super Large Crawled, I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, but corpus. And you can use this, which is some, sort of semi pre-processed version of the Internet Archive. And if I remember correctly, there are even versions of sort of the Internet's data by language too. So if you wanted to do things in a particular language or look at differences across languages, this might be a good place for you to start. Okay, so I considered actually doing an assignment where I was going to ask you to process the entire web, but then I thought about how much you'd suffer, and my better nature compelled me to use a humbler subset of the World Wide Web, actually a very small subset of that humble subset, which is Wikipedia. And so in this particular part of the tutorial, we'll be looking at doing some processing of the Wikipedia data, and specifically we're going to revisit tokenization using Wikitext, which is available for download directly from the Hugging Face Load Dataset tool. As we've done before, I'm going to take all of the data inside the dataset and I'm going to sort of flatten it out, and I'm going to actually write it to a file in this case. Okay, that file can be found at this location, and it's not that big. It's a humble half of a gigabyte, which is still rather small by NLP standards, but it's going to do for our tutorials purposes. Okay, the reason I wanted to use Wikipedia's data, which is a little bit larger than some of the things we've dealt with in this course so far, is because I wanted to revisit the topic of byte pair encoding. Now, you remember in the first homework, I think we asked you to code up BPE. And some of you noticed that the BPE encodings, they worked, but they were not particularly excellent. And that's because you all were using rather small data sets. And for any kind of data-driven approach like BPE, you're going to need a much larger corpus of text. Okay, so my hope is that with the 500 megabytes of Wikitext data, you'll have enough that we might be able to use BPE for some more sensible tokenization results. Another reason I wanted to introduce BPE here is because if you want to get into the general domain of natural language processing or the use of natural language processing tools, many of the contemporary models like the transformers are going to use derivatives of byte pair encoding. Okay, there's one model called word sense, there's sentence piece, there's all sorts of tokenization methods that are completely data-driven, and having some familiarity with these when it's appropriate to use them, when it's not, is going to be important if you want to do work in the domain. Okay, so what I've done is I've written myself a pre-processing and tokenization pipeline that's going to use BPE on the Wikipedia corpus. Okay, the pipeline consists of the following. I import the training data for the tokenizer. Here's the wiki text that we downloaded and saved. I speak about the type of tokenizer I want to use. Notice that this is coming from the tokenizers library, which is also developed by Hugging Face, and there's more than one of these tokenizers that are available through the Hugging Face library that you can experiment with. The tokenizers have an ability to specify something called a pre-tokenization set of functions. So these are things that you do before you start the formal tokenizer, with byte pair encoding, for example. In my case, I wanted to split on punctuations, and I wanted to split on digits. This way, if I had 2 exclamation marks in a row, for instance, this function would take care of that. Okay. The next thing that you can specify in these tokenizers is a normalization approach. So these are things that you want to do to the text to kind of normalize it. So for example, we might want to cast the text to lowercase. We might want to remove any kind of accents from the characters. And it's usually a good practice, depending on the encoding you're dealing with, to try to fix encoding issues. Okay, the last thing that we might want to do is specify some special tokens that are not necessarily in the text. You probably recall that we discussed this in the last tutorial. We took some tokens, special tokens, we added them to our vocabulary, remember? And we did that because we were going to use those tokens for some special purposes. When you're training transformer models, you'll see in the literature that one of those special tokens is this mask token, which will be used to artificially corrupt data when training. In BERT, for example, you take a sentence as an input and you try to create that sentence as the output. So the sequence is the same sentence, except that you're masking pieces of the input and trying to recreate it at the output so that you train BERT to generate sentences that way. Okay. Unknown here could indicate an out of vocabulary token. As we saw in the lecture, this could indicate the end of a text block. This could indicate the start of text block, and we could have this pad just for the purposes of our tensors. Okay. You can train these tokenizers using the following function, and you can also save the model so that you don't have to train these models more than once. Even with the half a gig, this actually takes a bit of time to train, and so you'll definitely want to save any kind of tokenizer outputs that you generate if you're doing this for a larger data set. Okay, and then this particular block of code actually generates two files. One is a vocab.json file, and then one is a merges.txt file. This merges.txt, if you remember from the first homework, just tells us the recipe that we follow to perform the tokenization. So which two characters do we glue together as a first step, followed by what are the next two characters we glue together, and so on in the case of BPE. And then this tells us the set of vocabulary that we generate as a consequence of that. Okay, so I can take my tokenizer and I can encode, for example, this sentence. And I can also decode that sentence using the same tokenizer. And I can print out some representations of that just so that you can see it works. I can take this string, I didn't win a $2,000 trip to New York, and you can see here that my tokenizer generates a start of sequence character, and then it's generated automatically on its own a tokenization of the string. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. The first is that it's assigned each of those words over here an ID, which is accessible through encoded.IDs. These could be useful. Why? Because these are the index in the vocabulary. And as you saw in the last homework, you could use this index of the vocabulary as well as some sorted word vectors so that you could represent now each of these encoded strings as a word vector, right? Using this word ID index. And of course, you can move from this representation here that your model might output back to the original representation through this decoded operation. Okay, there are a couple of things that are a little bit odd about this encoded string. You might have noticed the first is that this character G with a little dot on it shows up. This is a consequence of computing things at the byte level with BPE. There's nothing particularly special about this token. It's just a consequence of the way that we did the byte pair encoding. Okay, and as you noticed here, probably in your earlier assignments, and it's also relevant here, when you do anything that's data-driven, you don't have guarantees that things will tokenize the way that you want them to. So for example, didn't here was split into 3 tokens instead of 1. That may or may not be what we want to do. Okay, and furthermore, because of the way that byte pair encoding works, it took this token, which it had never seen in the training data from Wikipedia, and because of the sequential way in which it constructs tokens, it turned the crying face into a representation like this. This has pros and cons, right? The pro is that we're never going to have an unknown token if we do it this way. The con is that this really doesn't mean sort of the same thing in a token-to-token sense as the single crying face token does. Okay, so just be aware of some of these peculiarities when you use different tokenization approaches that are data-driven. It's usually useful to sort of take a sentence like this that has strange characters and kind of test out and see how well your approach worked. Okay, there may also be circumstances, of course, just like when we saw with the glove embedding, where you don't want to train your own tokenizer from scratch. You might want to load a tokenizer. And as long as you have the vocab.json and the merges.txt file, you can actually load those in to initiate a byte pair encoding tokenizer, and you can sort of use those right out the box. I've got here a journey to the center of the earth. And you can see here, I just loaded these, by the way, from what we already generated together from Wikipedia, and you can see it does a good job with the tokenization here. Okay, well, because this allows us to take two files that were generated, in this case by us, we could also take files that are generated by other people, right? We could take, for example, if we were interested in using the GPT-2 model, which is a transformer, a pretty famous transformer model, which is described in this hyperlink here. We could download the vocab.json, which is available here, and merges.txt, and we could actually just include them up here in this, and we'd be able to use the exact tokenizer that was used by GPT-2. There are obviously other open source tools that allow you to take advantage of tokenizers used by many of the more popular NLP models like BERT or XLNet. And these are also freely available in Hugging Face's Transformers library. So I've initiated two here just as an example, one for word piece, one for using a sentence piece based algorithm. This one is from BERT, this one's from XLNet. And I'm showing you the tokenization of both of the sentences here. And again, it's usually useful to put in some odd or corner case sentences as a way to gain an intuition for how each of these tokenizers are going to deal with the sentences you might be interested in for your particular use case. Okay, so for the first learning exercise, your goal is going to be to implement the unigram tokenization approach from scratch that's described in this paper. Okay, so I'd like you to read through this and understand the unigram tokenization approach that's proposed therein. And once you've coded up the unigram tokenization approach, demonstrate it on the Wikipedia data that we pulled here. If the data is too big, that's okay. You can use a smaller subset. The whole point here is for you to demonstrate that your tokenizer works. Okay? You can comment on the advantages of this approach over BPE as well at the end of the assignment here. Okay, in the second part of the tutorial, we'll be covering sequence-to-sequence models. And here, what I'd like to do is refer you to the following online example, which is actually provided by PyTorch. So this is the PyTorch's official documentation, and they have an example of how you do sequence-to-sequence networks with attention. And I think that we've gone over together enough examples that you should have familiarity with PyTorch to the point where you can read through a tutorial like this that's on the web and be able to follow it and adapt it for a purpose that you're interested in. So what I'd like you to do, having read this one myself, is take a look at this one, read through it, try out some of the implementations to gain some familiarity with sequence-to-sequence for attention. And use what you learn to build a recurrent question-answer model. That is, using that exact same tutorial as sort of a starting point or inspiration, I want you to develop and train a model that provides an answer to a given question. Now, the data that you're going to use to train your question-answer model is the WikiQA dataset. That's this one here, which I provided a link to. You can see it contains questions like, how are glacier caves formed? And it has an answer. And then another question and another answer, and so on. Okay, I want you to take that, train the model with it, and then visualize the loss of the model on the training, validation, and test splits. And you can choose how you want to do this visualization based on what you've done in previous assignments. You can also choose how you want to do the splitting based on what you've done in previous assignments. Just justify your choices. I've included, by the way, here in the question how you load the WikiQA data using the load dataset function from Hugging Face, just in case you weren't familiar with how to do it. Once you've implemented this model and assessed it, I want you to display the model's answer to several questions of your choice. So come up with some new questions that you think are fun, pop them in the model, and see what the model tells you. I also want you to visualize the attention of the model for some of the sample questions that you selected and interpret the results. So in this last part of the tutorial, we're going to be covering transformers.
And if you understood how the basic transformer model worked from the lecture, then honestly, you're equipped to understand pretty much all the variants of transformer-based NLP models that exist today and are coming out of the pipelines moving forward. If you're interested in seeing or using some of the contemporary implementations, Hugging Face does a really good job of implementing those models. And so you can visit, for example, the hyperlink I've provided there, and you can see there is a link to each of the models here in PyTorch for many of the contemporary models that have been released in recent times. I mean, this includes Albert, Bart, Bert, DeBerta, Distillabert, GPT-2, and so on and so forth. There's several of these that are only a couple years old, sometimes less than a year old, that you can obtain access to. Okay, in practice, you're not going to probably be able to train these models because they require insanely large data sets to work well, and they require computational power that is far beyond what is tenable in our course and even many academic research labs. And so for this reason, people tend to use these models as starting points and to fine-tune the models for a specific problem of interest. That is, you take one of the models, for example, that's provided by Hugging Face, that was originally trained by Google, Facebook, or some other rich entity with lots of TPUs, and then you start the weights at whatever they had, and you're going to sort of fine-tune them from there to have those weights be specialized to whatever task you're interested in. It could be a translation task, it could be a question-answer task, what have you, right? You sort of tune from those starting positions so that the transformer works well in your case. Now, because the pace of NLP research is really fast and there's a lot of models to choose from, I'm actually more interested in teaching you how to navigate the NLP literature at this stage than I am in getting you familiar with any one transformer implementation. The reason is, let's say we cover BERT or Albert or 2 or 3 other of these implementations. We can do that, and then 3 months from now, those implementations will be completely redundant, and it won't be as useful as you gaining familiarity or experience with how you read the literature yourself, and you kind of understand the pros and the cons of different approaches for the various transformers that exist now and the ones that are inevitably going to come out on the horizon. Okay, so having said that, the third learning exercise, which is worth a majority of the points for the week, has 2 things I'd like you to work on. The first is completely just, it's like a literature review. There's no code involved. I want you to take the 32 transformer models that were referenced in this page here. So you can see there's 1 through actually 33, but these are other community models. So you can ignore these for now, just take the first 32. And what I would like you to do is just very briefly, like I've shown you down here in the example of Albert, comment on the approach. So what distinguishes this approach from some other models in the NLP community? What's the advantage of the approach? What motivated basically the authors to come up with this model versus what existed? And what's the disadvantage of the approach? This process is, I think, an important one for you to go through, because if you decide to use transformers either for your project or as part of your research, it's critical that you know which of these models that have already been trained you should start with for your tuning. And the point of the homework is to have you have enough familiarity so that you know where to start from if you choose to use a transformer model and tune it for your purposes. Okay, once we've gone through this, then obviously the next step will be to tune a transformer. So what I'd like you to do is, using the skeleton code that I've provided below as a starting point, tune the BERT sequence model for a problem of your choice. So you can take data from your project, you can take data from a previous assignment, you can take some of the data that's from the Hugging Face load data function that you think is interesting or useful. And I basically want you to tune a transformer of your choice so that you can compare how the transformer worked before tuning and after tuning. Okay, and I just want you to comment on any differences that exist. If computation is a problem for you, you don't have to tune them for very long, just enough so that you can start to see some difference between the model when it's tuned by your method versus not tuned by your method for some held out validation or test set, for example. And that's it.